And thank you once again, folks. This is your host, Joe Jimmy, here on Black Chat Radio. This is the month of June 2012. We are found exclusively on the Black Independent Media channel within the Roku network. We want to thank our listeners and those of you who tune into the show. Please tell a friend, let people know about the show, the Black Independent Media channel. Spread the word. We love you all. We appreciate it. We like to expand the show on several different platforms. And once again, thank you all for listening and tuning in. Okay, folks, I wanted to go ahead and, as I promised on last show, that I would continue on the discussion, internal bleeding, what is wrong with Black Africa? Okay, and truth be told, folks, let me say that I received a lot of flack for the last show. Even within my inner circle, actually not a lot, it was balanced, but I received some flack. A lot of people said that it was something that needed to be heard, or rather voiced, that they were proud, and they said that it was about time that somebody talked very, straightforward about what was going on. But some of you, or rather some of the things that I've heard, that, it was negative, that I didn't have anything positive to say about Africa, that, everything was negative, there was nothing positive, and that I did more harm than good. Somebody told me that it was just negative, and you did more harm than good. And, you didn't have anything that was uplifting to say. Folks, let me first say that here on Black Chat Radio, I'm not going to apologize for a number of reasons. I'm not going to apologize for what's said on this show. I'm not going to apologize for last week's show. Here's the thing. It was almost as if I was given an ultimatum, either or. Either I tell the truth, or I lie and talk about just, the positives of Africa. Okay? Folks, that would be, in my opinion, very disrespectful to Black folk, not only in Africa, but around the world. Because, it's a great disservice when you turn a blind eye to what's in front of your face, and versus you want to see everything through rose-colored lenses. We're not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And like I said, those of you, look, if you wanted me to highlight, for example, some of the positives, I'm sure there's a few places in Africa where things are okay. Okay. For example, in South Africa, you have the safaris. Well, in several parts of Africa, you have the safaris where you can go out and have a safari hunt, a good vacation, very good, acceptable amenities, hotels, etc. But folks, let us not forget that all of those, or 99% of those, are owned by whites. Okay, white companies, white corporations, white individuals who own that and run those. They may have Black employees here and there, but they're owned by whites, mostly white Europeans, Danish, Norwegians, French, Italian, Portuguese. They don't represent Black Africans whatsoever. And I won't disrespect the Black African people by highlighting white-owned companies and organizations, most of which who would rather not deal with Black Africans at all. And when you talk about from a historical sense, you talk about the colonialism, the tyranny for those several hundred years. They've never respected any Black person, any Black African person at all. Okay, and we're not going to do that on the show. Okay, we're not, they already disrespect and despise Blacks enough as it is. Here on Black Chat Radio, we will not extend that. Okay, I'm not going to talk about fantasy worlds and white hotels and white vacation spots you can go to in Africa, because that's just disrespectful to the people, and I will not do that. So that's just something that some of you all will have to contend with. But anyway, folks, this week I wanted to talk about a very special individual, the gentleman by the name of Mr. Thomas Sankara. I mentioned him in last week's show, and I said that I was going to expand on that for this week's show. This young man came to power in 1983 in the country that was called Upper Volta. It was a French colony that achieved its so-called independence in 1960. And folks, anytime I hear that about these black African countries, or Haiti, for example, talking about independence, that's very questionable. Their status has always been very questionable, because those countries really have achieved no independence whatsoever, because those white countries, those white tyrant countries, in fact, control those black African governments from the outside. And they do that through the corrupt and ignorant and stupid black African leaders by proxy. Okay, but anyway, the country of Upper Volta, which is now called Burkina Faso, was a French colony, and as before, as in all black African countries, be it in 1983, when Mr. Thomas Sankara was alive, or be it here in 2012, massive corruption, massive poverty, zero productivity, begging for food, coveting flies. That was pretty much the standard quo for the country, and that was the case back in 1983 prior to Mr. Sankara coming to power. But anyway, Mr. Thomas Sankara came into power back in 1983, and this young man at the age of 33 began a revolution. I call it a revolution because he did something that very few, if any, black African leaders had done prior to that. There have been revolutionaries throughout the country, Stephen Biko in South Africa, several. But Mr. Sankara is very special because he actually focused on the corruption and the problems within, the internal bleeding, as we call this series, there in Burkina Faso. What was called Upper Volta. Mr. Sankara, when he came into power in 1983, one of the first things he did was eliminate any and all privileges to government officials and ministers. Okay, at that time, the corruption being so massive, they demanded that they drive around a Mercedes-Benz. People in the government, they had to have a Mercedes-Benz. They had to have all these, the bribes and corruption money. Mr. Sankara did away with that. He demanded that the salaries of all government officials be brought in line with the country. He eliminated the Mercedes-Benzes. He eliminated he fought feverishly to eliminate the corruption. Those were one of his few of many reforms that he enacted after coming into power in 1983. Okay, what this young man did was increase food production for the country. He eliminated this dependence on the IMF, for example, the International Monetary Fund. And he made several speeches basically stating that we didn't need to be dependent on these foreign entities, these white foreign entities, for anything. He had the mindset that black people were too intelligent, too capable, too hardworking and productive to be begging and begging and begging the IMF and white countries for food. He refused to accept the mantra that black people were too lazy and too dumb to do for themselves. He increased food production in the country. For the first time, Burkina Faso was exporting food. Okay, this man could have been a revolution not only for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. Okay, he could have, and those of us who are old enough, we all remember the images of Africa back in the 1980s, and that hasn't really changed today. But remember, the people, the children, covered in flies, begging for food, their hands shaped like cups from begging continuously throughout the day. Mr. Thomas Sankara changed it. For the first time, that a black African country was exporting food. Okay, the productivity was up. They had pride and self-respect. They had the foundations of building a people with pride and self-respect and not having to beg for food. Okay. The French, of course, were very alarmed with this young man's aspirations. Okay. And not only the French folks, but pretty much all of these European countries, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, the Danish, Denmark. Whether you like it or not, folks, most of these European countries are dependent on black African countries for pretty much everything. Okay, their raw materials, their food, certainly their energy resources, the oil, natural gas. Folks, so let me tell you right now, if it were not for these black African countries, most of these European countries would be in poverty. Okay? Particularly when you talk about Germany, they say Germany. Right now, Germany is one of the most productive European countries. They have, we all know of the German automobile industry. Folks, most of that metal for those German cars is black African metal from various black African countries, whether you like that or not. Okay? But anyway, these white countries, these white terrorist or white tyranny countries, they have always and continue to have a vested interest in keeping black Africa backwards, corrupt. They install dictatorships. This is basically what happened, folks, and not to oversimplify, but basically when these African countries so-called achieved their independence back in the 1960s, most of these white countries installed dictatorships. Okay? And therein lie, they could control these black African countries from externally through a proxy, through a black African leader and his cabinet. This was the case with Burkina Faso, or this is the case with Burkina Faso and Thomas Sankara when he was assassinated, brutally assassinated. And I say that because, folks, I'll get to that later, but Mr. Thomas Sankara, his brief legacy was cut violently short by, you guessed it, one of his own, another black African. A gentleman by the name was Blaise Compaoré. And pardon me, folks, for my pronunciation is not correct. Pardon me for that. It's a French name, but his name, Blaise Compaoré. He is still in government right now in Burkina Faso. But anyway, right now, back to Mr. Sankara. Mr. Sankara installed all these great reforms in Upper Volta or Burkina Faso. He was on the path of literally changing the face of Africa, not only for his own country, but the face of the entire continent, the black African continent, to get them on the path of self-sufficiency and productivity. Okay. As of 2000, Mr. Sankara was brutally and savagely assassinated by a coup d'etat led by the Mr. Blaise Compaoré. His body was dismembered and buried in an unmarked grave by, yes, you guessed it, other black Africans, as I said before. So primitive, so brutal, and so savage. This man, not only did they kill him, shoot him down, they chopped up his body and buried in an unmarked grave. You cannot find Mr. Sankara's grave anywhere. There's a memorial for him, a very small memorial that the people built, but no one knows where he's buried. Mr. Blaise Compaoré, who had him killed, or who killed him himself, he knows where he's buried. This gentleman is 61 years of age right now. He is right now, and he was reelected as of 2010 in Burkina Faso. He knows where Mr. Sankara is buried, but I highly doubt that he'll be releasing that information. But folks, this young man who said, you know, we don't need the IMF. We need France. We don't need Spain. We don't need Portugal. We don't need Denmark. We don't need the Netherlands. Black people are too talented to do for ourselves. We don't need to be begging and begging and begging for food. We can do for ourselves. He was, food production skyrocketed when this young man came into power. And he was, brutally killed by another black person, as it has always been for the revolutionaries, the very few black African revolutionaries who have tried to turn black Africa around and get them from under the tyranny of these so-called white countries, the former colonial countries who have so maligned black Africa for so long. But folks, let us look at this, folks, because this is not isolated to black Africa. Again, as I said in the last show, we look at the history of Haiti, Jamaica, we look at Tanzania, all of these countries where you see the French, the Spanish, still, after several hundred years, manipulating and preventing black people from enjoying independence and productivity in their own countries. They want black Africa and they want Haiti and these countries to be corrupt and dysfunctional because they need the metals and the oil and the natural gas from these countries. And the sad part about it is that we do not hear anything here in the United States. The Congressional Black Caucus, black leaders, Mr. so-called black president, Mr. Barack Obama, why are these white countries not being held accountable for their tyranny and their terrorism of these black African countries? Why hasn't the black president, Mr. Barack Obama, held France accountable, held Spain, held Portugal, held Denmark accountable for supporting and giving, these multi-billion-dollar loans, weapons, logistical support to these dictatorships in these black African countries? Why has he not condemned these countries and held them accountable for what they're doing? Because believe it or not, folks, these countries, these white European countries are, in fact, by definition of what they're doing, they are engaged in a proxy war against black Africans. A proxy war, meaning that they are going through, it's not a direct war, but they are going through black Africans to suppress and control black Africans and to keep them in poverty and to keep them ignorant and to keep them from achieving true independence. Why do we not hear anything from here within the United States? Why are not these individuals these countries being held accountable and being brought to task for their actions? Okay, I leave that to you to ask these same questions to the various individuals here in America, the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Black President Barack Obama. They've said nothing about what's been happening in these countries. But anyway, Mr. Sankara, he brought these magnificent reforms in Burkina Faso. He did away with the corruption. He fought feverishly to destroy the corrupt apparatus in black Africa. And he said to the people of Africa in his country and throughout Africa, we can do better. We can do better. We ought to be ashamed of this, of begging and having our people covered in flies and begging for food. We ought to be ashamed. And he put them to work, folks. He put them to work. He made them productive. Food production, exporting food. I mean, who knows what would have happened if Mr. Sankara was allowed to live out his dream? Okay. But we see now, and the very sad part about it is the gentleman who killed Mr. Sankara, who chopped up his body and had him buried in an unmarked grave, Mr. Blaise Compaoré. he is right now, as of 2012, still president of Burkina Faso, or Upper Volta. He is still president. He is reelected as of 2012. And believe you me, it is my opinion, I have absolutely no confidence that that was a democratic election, or this man has ever had a democratic election since he came into power with that bloody coup d'etat back in 2000, or 1983 rather. I'm sorry, 2000. But anyway, no. Mr. Sankara came into power in 1983. But I mean, I doubt Mr. Blaise Compaoré has ever been democratically elected in that country. I believe it's a dictatorship in secret. If they do have an election, those election results are thrown out, destroyed, and the French, with the assistance of the French and various white European countries, they dictate the election results to the people of Burkina Faso. That Mr. Blaise Compaoré was once again reelected in 2010. They dictated that to them. I would bet everything that I have and everything that I own that this is what they're doing. They're dictating to the people of Burkina Faso that this gentleman was once again reelected. This primitive, brutal, savage animal was reelected once again. But folks, we ought to be, this makes me very sad and it hurts me to my soul. This young man, Mr. Thomas Sankara, who was such a beacon of hope for all of Africa, not for just his country, but he could have set the tone. He could have set the example for all Black Africans and Black African governments on how to carry themselves. You don't need to beg for food. You don't need to beg the IMF for loans. These disastrous loans, multi-billion-dollar loans that you'll never ever pay back. And folks, those of you who are not familiar with the IMF or the International Monetary Fund, this is primarily a white entity comprised of several white European countries and the United States, believe it or not, who issue these multi-billion-dollar loans to these Black African countries, which they will never pay off. Okay, and you have various companies and individuals here in the United States who in fact have interests in the IMF. Okay, they want that money back. They have promissory notes and various financial vehicles to where they want these Black African countries in permanent debt where they can make money off of that debt. Why are we not hearing anything about this within the United States from the so-called Black leaders and Black government holders or seat holders? Why is the IMF not being held accountable? Why are these white European countries, these tyranny governments, being held accountable for what they're doing to Black Africa and what they've been doing for several hundred years to Black Africans and Black African governments in general? But once again, folks, they are doing it through other Black Africans. Mr. Blaise Compaoré, once again, this gentleman, France provided him the weapons, logistical support, and the financial support to go in and have Mr. Thomas Sankara brutally and savagely killed as such. They provided the means for him to do that, and this man is still in power in that country as of 2012. It's such a tragedy, folks, because this, like I said, this man could have served as the template for the future of Black Africa, and his life was cut short, so brutally short, by another Black man. All right. And as I understand, Mr. Compaoré, what he did after killing Mr. Sankara, he reinstated all of the practices that were in place prior to Mr. Sankara coming to government. He reinstated the IMF. He reinstated the loans. He reinstated the bribes and corruption. He called it what he called a rectification. Mr. Blaise Compaoré, he called it a rectification government, wherein the white European countries would once again be allowed to come in and have free access to natural resources. And his door was open to the bribes, the many bribes, the multi-million-dollar bribes, for them to come in and do as they pleased, while the people he's supposed to represent remain in extreme poverty, extreme ignorance, and in a backwater, an economic and social backwater. This has everything to do, folks, with the self-hatred that black people have, because the French could not have done this. Mr. Blaise Compaoré, folks, the sad part about it, Mr. Thomas Sankara trusted this man. He was part of his cabinet. This is black self-hatred on a platter, folks. This is the template for black people's self-hatred. Mr. Blaise Compaoré was part of Mr. Sankara's government. He was part of his cabinet. He trusted him. And this man turned around and had him brutally and savagely murdered. Body dismembered, chopped up, and buried in an unmarked grave in 2000. Ladies and gentlemen, I say to you, it hurts me to talk about this. It hurts me because we see in Burkina Faso right now the extreme poverty the people live in. That the hope and the promise that Mr. Sankara brought was so immediately dashed and destroyed with this government. And the fact that this man is still in power, he is still in power. Mr. Blaise Compaoré, that brutal, savage, primitive animal, is still in power as of 2012. Nobody is holding France or Germany or Spain or Denmark or Norway accountable for what they did and what they continue to do right now in these black African countries. Nobody's holding them accountable. Nobody's getting arrested for supporting dictatorships or terrorism. Okay, they are engaged in a proxy war against black Africans by supporting these dictatorships, by providing money and weapons and logistical support to these dictatorships. Nobody is holding them accountable. Nobody in the United States is condemning France. Possibly, the World Court, the World Court. Nobody's holding them accountable. Nobody's getting arrested. Nothing. It's not even on being discussed at all. The United Nations. You would hope that somebody would be going to them and saying, "Hey, France, who's talking about they support democracy and freedom, at the same time has provided several $1 million to dictatorships all throughout Africa. When are we bringing them to justice?" Nobody's even talking about that. It's such a tragedy, and it continues right now as we speak. This man is still in power, and he was reelected back in 2010, and his reign of terror and tyranny, empowered by the French and the Germans and the Portuguese, continues today, and nobody says nothing about it. In Haiti, we can talk about that, how the French and some of these other white countries have tried to manipulate and keep the Haitians in poverty. But folks, Mr. Sankara, what's so tragic about it is that this young man could have been such a beacon and served as the example for others to follow. That African countries should have been following his lead in reforms throughout the continent. But folks, we want to hear from you. blackchatradio.blogspot.com. I am your host, Joe Jimmy. We're talking about Mr. Thomas Sankara of Upper Volta, or what now is called Burkina Faso. The hope that he represented in that country, The fact that he did away with corruption as best he could. He eliminated the privileges of those in government. He eliminated the Mercedes-Benz, the corruption, the bribes. He brought food productivity up. He brought black African people. He made them productive and said, folks, we can work. We should be productive. We should want to, we can do this. We are too intelligent, to be able to work for ourselves and produce our own food versus begging foreign countries, people who despise us. These French and Italians and Germans and Portuguese folks, understand, in these countries, they heavily discriminate against black Africans. Those of you who are aware of international politics and who've traveled abroad, who know this, in France, in Germany, in Portugal, in Spain, they do not want black Africans in their country. They heavily discriminate against them. You hear about it all the time, about black African immigrants who are brutally beaten and killed by police in those countries. But yet they turn around and do business with black African countries. They need the oil and the natural gas and the metals and the minerals and et cetera, from these black African countries. They don't need, however, the black African people in their countries. And we see the gross stupidity of these black African leaders who in turn do business with them. Mr. Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, he does business with France. Can his black children and his black relatives go to France and enjoy themselves? Probably not. Lest they be beaten and shot and pulled over by the French police or the Spanish police and be killed and put in jail by them. I mean, do we see the gross stupidity in this, folks? They would rather, they have no respect for black African people they're supposed to represent. They have no respect for the African languages or their traditions. No, but he greatly respects the white Europeans, the French and the Portuguese and the Danish and the Netherlands. He greatly respects their money and their patronage and their corruption and their bribes. He respects that, but he has no respect for the black African people he's supposed to represent. And nobody's condemning these countries. Nobody's holding France or Spain or Germany or Denmark, any of these countries. None of them are being held accountable for what they're doing and what they've been doing in black Africa for several hundred years. It's not even being talked about. But folks, we want to hear from you, folks. Nobody's been commenting very much on the website. That's blackchatradio.blogspot.com. You should see it on your screen momentarily if it's not on there already. We want to hear from you, folks. Feel free to comment. You don't even have to create an account. You can comment anonymously. You don't have to create an account. You can comment anonymously. Of course, we have to approve of that. Those comments. We don't want to have any threats or anything illegal on the site, but we want to hear from you, folks. Why, and I would say to the people of Burkina Faso or Upper Volta, please do whatever you can to get rid of the government of Mr. Blaise Compaoré and his cabinet. Do whatever you can to get rid of that corrupt, degenerate, garbage, traitorous government that is in power right now in Burkina Faso. Please do whatever you can to get rid of that government. That man has no respect for you at all. He has no respect for anything black African whatsoever. Please do what you can. We see folks in the Arab Spring. The Arabs are out there giving their lives. They are dying every day to rid themselves of these dictatorships, of these corrupt governments who in large part are supported by white European countries and the United States. They are giving their lives to get rid of these governments. Why is there no black African spring to rid yourselves of these stupid, incompetent, and traitorous black African governments who have no respect for you at all? They respect white people and their governments and their money. And in turn, these white governments These white countries have no respect for black Africans at all, have never respected them, have never respected their languages, their culture, anything. We need a black African spring. They say the Arab Spring, they're giving their lives to fighting and dying against tyranny. The black African needs to do the same. We need a black African spring. Mr. Black Man, Mr. Black African man, I ask you, when will you make those sacrifices? When will you make those sacrifices? When are you willing to say enough is enough? How embarrassed, how low do we have to get? How bad do the conditions have to get before we say enough is enough? We've had enough of the corruption. You are murdering our bright and smart leaders who are trying to bring change. Enough is enough. When will that happen? The Arabs are doing it. Why can't the black African do it? And those of you listeners in the black African community, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from you. If you are listening to this program, we want to hear from you. Where is the change coming? When is it coming? When, Mr. Black Man, Mr. Black African man, when are the sacrifices going to be made? When will you make those sacrifices? How bad does it have to get? Okay, folks, this is your host, Joe Jimmy. This is Black Chat Radio here on the Black Independent Media Channel exclusively. We will continue this conversation. This is, again, the multi-part series, Internal Bleeding. And for today's show, for the most part, we talked about the gentleman, Mr. Thomas Sankara, brutally and savagely murdered. He came into power in 1983 in the country what was called Upper Volta, which is now called Burkina Faso. This young man had so many great reforms. He was a beacon of hope for millions of people, and he was savagely and brutally murdered back in the year 2000 by one of his own black cabinet members, Mr. Blaise Compaoré. His body was dismembered. He was buried in an unmarked grave. It hurts me. It hurts my soul and my heart. I'm halfway emotional talking about this, folks, because the future was killed off with Mr. Thomas Sankara. And to close today's show, folks, I want to end this day's show with a moment of silence for Mr. Thomas Sankara. Let us do it. Let us have a brief moment of silence for him and his untimely end, beginning now. Okay, folks, that was our moment of silence for Mr. Thomas Sankara. God bless that man and what he tried to do for black Africans and for Africa and in general. Folks, if you can, in your own, here in the United States, which I assume the bulk of the listeners are coming from, please pressure your black elected officials. Let us condemn the IMF. Let us condemn these white European, these tyrant terrorist countries who are supporting dictatorships, who are providing financial, military, and logistical support to dictatorships all throughout Africa. Let us hold them accountable. Let us hold them accountable. Let us bring justice to them. Let us begin the process of opening up discussion on this, thereby bringing exposure and light on what exactly was going on. Because I'm sure most black people here in America, we are so ignorant about international affairs. We are so ignorant about culture overseas. We need to get educated, ladies and gentlemen. If you get a chance to travel overseas, please do so as soon as possible. Open your eyes, open your ears. Let us begin this process, because I've said this before, Black Africa ought to be the premier place for job opportunities, not only for black Africans, but for black folks all around the world. But because of corruption, the degeneracy of bribes, ignorance, people who could care less about the black people they're supposed to represent, Black Africa is in a backwater. It is in a primitive backwater, and this has to change, folks. Burkina Faso has to change. That government needs to be destroyed and gotten rid of as soon as possible. Anyway, folks, I am your host, Joe Jimmy. This is Black Chat Radio here on the Black Independent Media Channel. Please tune in next week's show. Please tell a friend, folks. We want to spread the word about the show. We want to expand. And chime in with your comments once again on blackchatradio.blogspot.com. We thank you all for